God is watching. A thief breaks into a house under the cover of darkness. The occupants are away. He has the house to himself, or so he thinks. As he enters the living room and looks for valuables to steal, out of the darkness comes an eerie voice. Jesus is watching you. Startled, the thief turns off his torch. The room is quiet. He thinks he must be hearing things. Maybe his conscience is getting the better of him. After a few moments, he continues his criminal pursuit. Again, a voice from the darkness says, Jesus is watching you. Now the thief is really frightened. Who's there? He asks. The voice replies, I am, and so is Jesus. Through the beam of his torch, the robber sees a cage in the corner of the room and a parrot in the cage. Relieved, the thief approaches the parrot. What's your name? He asks. The parrot replies, I'm Moses. That's a funny name for a parrot, says the thief. What silly person names their parrot Moses? The parrot replies, the same silly person that named their Rottweiler Jesus. Jesus is watching you. In Psalm 139, David renders that same kind of sentiment in a much different way. He says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle in the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. It can be very uncomfortable to know that we're always being watched. We live in a surveillance society. The UK has more CCTV cameras per head than anywhere else in the world. Big Brother is watching us all the time. Edward Snowden, a former NSA intelligence contractor who exposed the NSA and CIA for their global surveillance program, that, among other things, was listening into everyone's mobile phone conversations. It was a massive worldwide breach of personal privacy perpetrated by a national government. In the recent past, we have had many internet scandals, Cambridge Analytica manipulating people's online information on a global scale. Our own government had a nudge unit, probably still has, set up in the Cabinet Office to use behavioral psychology to influence how you and I behave. Every time we access the internet, we leave a footprint, a cookie for others to see and follow. It's not a conspiracy theory to say that we are constantly being watched in society today. How does that knowledge make you feel? Are you comfortable with other people knowing your business and possessing your personal data? And yet, there is one person who already holds all of that information and more, who knows the very number of hairs on our head, who sees everything we do every second of every day, who saw us even before we were formed in the womb, and who knew us before we were ever born. O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me, said David at the beginning of Psalm 139. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes saw my unformed body. As a young child, when on those exceedingly rare occasions that I did something wrong and then failed to own up to it, my parents would often say, God knows. He sees everything you do. I remember being intimidated by that thought. The question is, does that knowledge that God is watching us fill us with fear or comfort? David's words, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" have a certain dubiety about them. He is trying to find comfort in those words, but the knowledge that God knows him completely and sees him constantly is also disturbing for David. We see this in how the psalm begins and ends. He says, "O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me." Past tense, you have searched me. It's already been done. God didn't seek permission. He did it. He didn't politely ask. He has already searched David. And then at the end of the psalm in verse 24, David says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." Only at the end of the psalm does David acknowledge that God is allowing him to search him. Only now is he accepting the inevitability of God always being there and always seeing him. You would think that the logic of the psalm would put those two phrases the other way around. David would ask, "Search me, O God," and then declare, "You have searched me." But that's not the way it is. David says, "You have searched me." And then he accepts that by the end of the psalm and asks God to continue. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." Psalm 139 is one of the Bible's clearest statements of God's presence, all-pervading presence. The psalm contains three attributes of God: his omniscience, his omnipresence, and his omnipotence. Let's just for a moment define those terms, because they are interrelated. And although we're only going to look at God's omnipresence this morning, let's understand what we mean by this. When we say that God is omnipotent, what do we mean? We mean that he has power, that he has might. But we mean more than that. We mean that God has all power. He is almighty. There's no power that exists apart from him. All power is derived from him and exists only in his will. I have the power to take a breath only because God allows it. And the moment he decides to withdraw that power, I will cease to breathe. God is almighty. If God is almighty, it stands to reason that he is all-knowing. He is omniscient. He knows everything there is to know. You can't be almighty and not know something in the universe. So God knows everything there is to know, from the smallest atom to the greatest planet. He knows you and I, and he knew us before we were ever born. Now, if God is almighty and he knows everything, then he must be able to see everything and see everything at once. Otherwise, there would be things he couldn't know. So God is omnipresent. He is everywhere and sees everything. There is nowhere for us to hide from him, nowhere where he is not. Jeremiah says, "Can anyone hide in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do not I fill heaven and the earth, declares the Lord?" Psalm 139 is about all three of those attributes as they interrelate. But we're going to concentrate just on one today. And it's that one that David has introduced to us when he says, "Where can I go from God?" Today we're going to consider verses 7 to 12 of Psalm 137. But there will be points when we'll drop into some of those other attributes of God, because it's impossible to speak about God in one term. We may use theological terms in our description of God. We may use a term to bring us to a greater understanding of God, but God is not a theological construction. God is personal. He is a complete being, the most complete being in existence. Saying one thing about him in isolation does not entirely describe who he is. God is whole. He is not summed up in one word or phrase or theological term. He is bigger and greater than you or I can ever imagine. But also he is person and he is personal. We know him in relationship, not in academic understanding, but in personal encounter. And this is what comes across so powerfully in David's words in Psalm 139. Listen to what he says. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? God's presence has personal consequences for David. And it has for you and I as well. It's not just that God knows everything. He knows me. He knows you. It's not just that God is everywhere. He is everywhere I am and everywhere you are. It's not just that God created everything. He created me. He created you. Derek Kidner in his commentary says, any small thoughts that we may have of God are magnificently transcended by this psalm. Yet for all its height and depth, it remains intensely personal from first to last. God sees me. He sees you. And dependent on our relationship with him, that understanding would either be hugely comforting or powerfully disturbing. Or maybe a bit of both, as David seems to acknowledge. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Is this a rhetorical question? Is David really looking to escape God? There is a sense of both comfort and fear in David's words. He's resigned to the fact that he cannot escape, but also somewhat content that that is the case. In many ways, David's words describe how we all are with God. We like to think that he is this benevolent, greater being in the universe, a protector who can guard us from the worst of what might be. But while that might be comforting, most of us don't want that benevolent, greater being to come too close, to examine us too closely. We are content with having God near us, but preferably not too near to us. God's presence is personal. God invades our personal space. His omnipresence means he is there all the time, at every moment, waking or sleeping. This is personal. David says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I go from God's spirit? God is present everywhere by his spirit. Charles Spurgeon comments and says that God is everywhere, but he is not everything. God is everywhere, but he is not everything. There is a tendency in modern spirituality to think of God or the sacred as being in everything. The kind of New Age Eastern spirituality would have us believe that we can find God in nature, that he exists in the life of the earth, that the universe and God are the same thing. And this view, called pantheism, is the belief at the root of much of the environmental cause at the moment. So you look at a flower and you see God. You stand under a tree and you meet with God. But God is not in the flowers, nor is he in the trees or the grass or the elements. He may speak through these things. We may see a reflection of the Creator's hand in nature, but God is present by his Spirit. God is not in things, he is spirit. And we need to be careful, especially when it comes to things such as environmentalism, that as Christians, we aren't reinforcing pagan beliefs about God and nature. This is the error that Romans 1 warns us about, that through God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood by what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And yet we have exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. We worship the creation, not the Creator. God is not in nature. His presence everywhere is by his Spirit. It is a personal presence that holds dominion over nature. God is everywhere, but he is not everything. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? The Hebrew word there means face, presence. Where can I hide from your face? Again, this is personal. God is not just around about us by his Spirit. He is in our personal space. He is facing us. We are face to face with him right now. We don't tend to like the kind of person that is always in our face, the insistent person, always demanding attention. And I'm not suggesting that for a moment that God is this kind of disagreeable character, but the language here is of that kind of pervasive, inevitable closeness from God. He's in our faces. Sometimes that kind of presence is very welcome when it comes with love, but not so welcome when it comes with judgment. God is everywhere. He is in our personal space. Let's quickly look at the extent of God's presence. How far does it reach? There are 4 if statements in this part of the psalm that David gives in his answer to that question, where can I go from God's presence? If I go up to the heavens, he says. If I go up to the heavens, you are there. A Catholic nun was sitting on a plane. The passenger sitting next to her was a little curious to see the nun praying through her rosary in the moments before takeoff, clearly afraid of flying. In an attempt to reassure her, the passenger said, "Don't worry, sister. God has said, I will be with you always." The nun replied, "No, he didn't. He said, 'Lo, I will be with you always.'" If I go to the heavens, you are there. The word heavens means everything above the earth. Do you remember that Sunday school chorus that goes, God's love is so low you can't get under it and so high you can't get over it? That's the sentiment David wants us to understand here. No matter how high we can go above the earth, no matter how distant we can travel into the universe, God is there. Man has landed on the moon, but that's as far as we've reached so far. We've probed the solar system, but we haven't even scratched the surface of what's actually out there in the great expanse of the universe. And yet, no matter where we go or how far we might get, God is already there. Not God's wisdom or knowledge, not a reflection of him, but God, by his Spirit, is there. This is true, of course, of the ultimate height of heaven itself. One day there will be a new heaven and a new earth, a home for the righteous, and at that time, according to the book of Revelation, the dwelling place of man will be, and the dwelling of God is with men, and he will be with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Heaven is the decisive presence of God. It's the highest and most and greatest expression of God's presence with his people. And this is where the whole course of history is heading. Inexorably, we are heading towards the presence of God. The consummation of all things is the presence of God forever and ever. It is Eden restored. It is the perfection of creation returned at the end of time. It is God once more in the Garden of Eden with his people. Look at the Bible story. The whole of the Bible is God establishing his presence with his people. With them in perfection in the garden, that was destroyed. He came again in a burning bush in the Exodus cloud, at the top of Mount Sinai with the commandments, in the Ark of the Covenant, in the temple in the Holy of Holies, in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, Emmanuel, God with us. And now through his Spirit, for his worshippers will worship him in spirit and truth. Everything God is doing is intended to restore his presence with his people. We are heading into God's presence. That's the end of the story. For now we see in a mirror dimly, But then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Face to face with God. All of us will come face to face with God. And that face to face encounter at the end of time will either be one of judgment or one of grace. No wonder part of David wants to run away. As he says later in the Psalm, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. He says, if I make my bed in the depths, you are there. The word depths is the word Sheol, which we often translate as hell, but it literally means the place of the dead or the grave. If I make my bed, if I choose even to die to get away from God, God is still there. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Even in death, we cannot escape God. Indeed, death is the very thing that God has conquered through his Son, Jesus Christ. Death is no escape from God. You'll be familiar with the story of Jonah. Jonah, when he was swallowed by that great fish after he had disobeyed God and tried to run away from God, he was then swallowed in that great fish after the storm on the boat. Jonah, in the depths of that fish, from the depths of the grave, he said, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Even in the belly of a fish, in the depths of the ocean, God was present with Jonah. Romans 8 says, for I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. But here's the rub of the story of Jonah. While God always loved Jonah, he did not always act in love towards Jonah. As Jonah tried to hide from God, God acted in judgment, the storm and the fish. And then as Jonah repented in the belly of the fish, God acted with grace and saved him. This is the thing about death itself. Death is not an escape from God, because even if I make my bed in the depths, God is there. But how we experience God in death will depend upon whether we are running away from him or running with him. For those who are denying God's presence in their lives, death will bring the experience of judgment. But those who know him and believe in him will experience his grace and salvation. You know, we should never entirely be comfortable in God's presence, but we should at least know where we stand. Are we running with him or running away from him? It is one thing to have a reverent fear of God, to know him as he's close to us and realize who he is. It's quite another to deny him and try to escape him. If I rise on the wings of the dawn is poetic language for the first rays of sunlight. Literally, it is, if I were to move even at the speed of light away from God, I will not escape him. Spurgeon says, light flies with inconceivable rapidity, and it flashes far ahead beyond all human ken. It illuminates the great and wide sea and sets its waves gleaming afar, but its speed would utterly fail if employed in flying from the Lord. What's faster than the speed of light? What's faster than the speed of light? Milk. Milk is faster than the speed of light because it's pasteurized before you see it. What's faster than the speed of light? The answer is the person who commanded at the very beginning of time, let there be light. As David declares in verse 12, light and darkness are the same to God, for he has knowledge, he has presence, and he has power over both light and darkness. Even if I settle in the far side of the sea, God is there. For the people of Israel, the far side of the sea was as far as they could possibly imagine. It was literally the ends of the earth. Literally the far ends of the earth. You remember that movie with Tom Hanks called Castaway, where he plays a modern-day Robinson Crusoe, marooned on a deserted island after a plane crash. He was so lonely on that island that he drew a face on a football and called it Wilson, so that he would have someone to talk to. Imagine being that alone. Imagine being marooned on the far side of the sea. Well, even in those loneliest moments, even when you're far from home, even when there's no one else around you, you don't need a face on a football to keep you company, because God is there. Even there, your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast, says David. What are we doing with God? In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, after their sin, tried to hide from God. I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. After their sin, they tried to hide from God. In this psalm, David is assured that even in the remotest place on earth, God's right hand will guide him and hold him fast. Adam and Eve were trying to desperately hide from God's right hand in his very presence. While David is a little nervous that God knows him completely and sees him continually, Adam and Eve are filled with fear and try to escape God. But there is no difference between David and Adam and Eve except one thing. David is following God while Adam and Eve are running away from him. David has allowed God to search his heart and deal with his sin, while Adam and Eve are still lost in their sin. How are you experiencing God? God is everywhere by his Spirit. We cannot escape him, even if we wanted to. There is nowhere to hide. The Lord God knows us completely, sees us continually. The hairs in our head are numbered, and the thoughts in our heart are known. Why are we trying to hide from him? Adam and Eve tried to hide even in the very presence of God. Today we are in the very presence of God. Are we trying to hide from him? Are you trying to hide from him? Are you denying God access into your personal space because of some sin or darkness that lies inside you that you don't want to admit to, that you don't want him to see? He already sees. The only response is to trust him and rely on his grace and his mercy in forgiveness. Open your hearts. Allow him in. You cannot resist him. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Amen.